I told you, tonight is fine.
The first lie didn't sound like a lie at all. It sounded normal, casual, almost loving, hidden in the back of his wife's car, barely breathing. He was supposed to be planning a surprise that might save their marriage. Instead, he heard a voice that didn't belong there and a promise that shattered everything he believed about his life. In that cramped darkness, with his heart pounding against cold metal, he realized the truth was far bigger than betrayal. This wasn't just about another man. It was about control, manipulation, and a plan that had been unfolding right in front of him while he trusted blindly. What he witnessed that night would force him to choose between exposing the truth or losing himself forever. Before we dive into this story, comment below with your location and local time so we know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, true-to-life stories like this one. The night he decided to hide in his wife's car, he told himself it was an act of love. Ethan Cole stood alone in the dim underground parking garage, the concrete still warm from the day's heat, listening to the echo of his own breathing. He had rehearsed this moment in his head a dozen times. He would wait in the back seat, surprise her after work, maybe laugh about how ridiculous it was. They would go out to dinner, talk, try again. Their marriage needed that kind of effort now. Or so he believed. For months, something had been off. Not loud arguments or dramatic fights. Those would have been easier to face. Instead, it was silence, short answers, her smile arriving half a second too late. She guarded her phone like it held state secrets. When Ethan reached for her at night, she said she was tired, stressed, distracted, always distracted. Still, he blamed himself. He always did. Ethan was the kind of man who believed that if something was breaking, it meant he hadn't held it carefully enough. The car door creaked softly as he slipped inside. Leather seats, faint traces of her perfume. He folded himself low behind the driver's seat, heart racing, feeling foolish and hopeful all at once. His phone buzzed once. Her text from earlier echoed in his mind. Running late. Don't wait up. That had been the final push. Minutes passed. The garage hummed with distant engines. Then headlights swept across the concrete wall, and her car rolled into the space. Ethan held his breath as the engine cut off. The driver's door opened, closed, and then her voice. Not speaking to herself, not on speaker. She was on a call, phone connected to the car's system. I told you. Tonight is fine, she said softly. Too softly. The tone she used when she didn't want to be overheard. Ethan's chest tightened. A man's voice responded through the speakers, calm and familiar, in a way that made Ethan's stomach drop. You sure he won't notice? She laughed. Not the polite laugh she gave coworkers. Not the restrained smile she showed Ethan lately. This laugh was warm, intimate. He never notices anything, she said. That's why this works. The words hit harder than any shout could have. Ethan pressed his palm against his mouth to keep from making a sound. His heart slammed so violently he was sure she could hear it through the seat. The unfairness of it burned months of trying, apologizing, shrinking himself, while she spoke about him like an inconvenience, like an obstacle. The car pulled out of the garage. Streetlights flashed through the windows in steady rhythm as the conversation continued. Each sentence peeling away another layer of the life Ethan thought he knew. Just be careful, the man said. Timing matters. It always does, she replied. I've thought this through. Thought what through? Ethan's mind raced, trying to catch up. This wasn't a careless affair. There was no guilt in her voice, no fear, only confidence. Planning. She turned down a quieter road, and with each turn, Ethan's hope collapsed further. This wasn't the way home, or to her office, or anywhere familiar. The injustice of it all settled deep in his chest. He had trusted her, defended her, when friends hinted something felt wrong, told himself love meant patience, not suspicion. Now he was trapped in the back seat of his own marriage, listening to it unravel in real time. The car stopped. Through the gap between the seats, Ethan saw her straighten her hair in the mirror, smooth her blouse. The same movements she used before date nights with him. Once, "I'll call you after," she said into the phone. "Don't worry, everything's under control." The call ended. Ethan's vision blurred. Control? That word echoed louder than the engine ever had. He wanted to burst out, confront her, demand explanations. But something colder, sharper, took hold instead. Instinct. If he revealed himself now, he would only see what she allowed him to see. Tears, excuses, half-truths. So he stayed hidden. She stepped out of the car, heels clicking against pavement. The door closed. Her footsteps faded. Silence rushed back in, thick and suffocating. Ethan sat there, long after, shaking, replaying every moment of the past year with new eyes. The late nights, the sudden business trips, the way she had started correcting him in public, subtly, like she was already rehearsing a life where he didn't matter. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a strategy. And somewhere in that silence, between heartbreak and clarity, Ethan understood one terrifying truth. Whatever his wife was planning, he was never meant to find out like this. But now that he had, there was no going back. Before this story continues, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you want to follow this journey to its end through betrayal, truth, and what comes after, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Ethan didn't move until the car grew cold. When he finally slid out from the back seat, his legs nearly gave out. The parking lot was empty now, the air sharp against his skin, as if the night itself were trying to wake him. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the car that no longer felt like hers or his, but like a crime scene he had accidentally wandered into. He didn't confront her when she came home. He didn't call. He didn't text. That restraint surprised even him. Instead, he went home, showered longer than necessary, and lay awake in bed listening to the ticking of the clock, replaying every word he had heard. Her voice, that laugh, the casual cruelty of, "He never notices anything." It wasn't just that she had someone else. It was that she had rewritten him in her mind as someone small, someone safe to deceive. And that was what hurt the most. By morning, something inside Ethan had shifted. The shock had hardened into clarity. If she believed he was blind, he would let her keep believing it just long enough. He started paying attention in ways he never had before. Not out of obsession, but precision. The way she angled her phone away from him, the sudden passwords on shared accounts, the new credit card statement that arrived at her office instead of their home. He noticed dates, times, patterns. At breakfast, she kissed his cheek and smiled like nothing had changed. "Busy day," she said lightly. "Don't wait up." He nodded, matching her calm, though his chest burned with the effort. "Take care," as Willow done. The unfairness of it made his hands tremble when she turned away. She was living two lives, and he was expected to keep playing the loyal husband in one while being erased from the other. That afternoon, Ethan took a day off work for the first time in years. Not to rest, to think. He spread documents across the dining table, bank statements, insurance papers, property deeds, things he had once trusted blindly. As he read, small irregularities began to surface. Policies adjusted. Beneficiaries changed. Decisions made quietly, efficiently. The story deepened. What terrified him wasn't just the betrayal. It was the calculation behind it. This wasn't impulse. This was preparation. Over the next week, Ethan became invisible in his own home. He listened more than he spoke, asked fewer questions, let her believe her performance was flawless. Meanwhile, he documented everything: dates, receipts, screenshots of synced devices she had forgotten to disconnect. Each discovery carved away another piece of the woman he thought he loved. One evening, while she showered, her phone buzzed on the counter. Ethan didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The name flashed across the screen, familiar now. attached to the voice from the car, a name he would never forget. The realization settled heavy in his gut. The man wasn't a stranger. He was someone from their orbit, someone who had sat at their table, laughed at their jokes, looked Ethan in the eye. The betrayal had roots. That night, Ethan sat alone on the balcony, long after she fell asleep. The city lights below blurred as his thoughts spiraled. Rage surged, then grief, then something steadier, resolve. He wasn't interested in explosive confrontations or dramatic scenes. Those would only give her control back. What he wanted was truth, clean, undeniable, and consequences. Days later, an unexpected message arrived. Anonymous, short. Be careful. Not everything is what it seems. Ethan stared at the screen, pulse quickening. For the first time since the parking garage, fear returned, not the fear of losing her, but of what she might be capable of. Someone else knew. Someone else was watching. The mystery widened. He realized then that he wasn't just uncovering an affair. He was stepping into a web of decisions that had been forming long before he hid in that car. Decisions that could cost him far more than a marriage if he made the wrong move. So he slowed down. He sought quiet advice without revealing too much. Old connections, professional opinions, framed as hypotheticals. Each conversation confirmed the same unsettling truth. If he acted emotionally, he would lose. If he acted strategically, he might survive this intact. At home, she continued her performance. Gentle questions, casual affection, plans for the future spoken just convincingly enough to feel real. Watching her now felt like watching an actor rehearse a role he already knew the ending to. And yet, beneath the anger, a strange sadness lingered. He mourned the man he had been, the one who trusted easily, who believed love was enough to protect him. That man was gone now. In his place stood someone quieter, sharper, awake. Ethan didn't know how this would end. He only knew it wouldn't end with him in the dark anymore, because once you see the truth from the back seat of your own life, you never forget what it feels like to be hidden, and you never let it happen again. The message haunted him for days. Be careful. Not everything is what it seems. Ethan read it over and over, searching for tone where none existed. No threat, no explanation, just a warning that felt heavier than any accusation. He deleted it, then recovered it, then locked it away in a folder he pretended didn't exist. Whoever had sent it knew something, and that meant his wife wasn't as alone in this as he had hoped. Paranoia crept in quietly. He began to notice how often she checked the rearview mirror while driving, how she paused before entering the house, as if rehearsing a version of herself she wanted him to see. At night, she slept easily. Too easily. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how someone could betray a life so completely and still rest without guilt. One evening, she mentioned a weekend trip. Work thing, she said, not meeting his eyes. Out of town. Ethan nodded, masking the surge of dread. That sounds important. It is, she replied, relief flickering across her face. I'll be back Sunday. The lie slid between them effortlessly. That night, Ethan made a decision he had been circling for weeks. He wasn't going to follow her. Not physically. That was what she would expect if she suspected anything. Instead, he followed the trail she couldn't erase. Digital shadows, paper records, the quiet footprints of preparation. The next morning, after she left, Ethan drove to a storage facility listed under her name. He had found it buried in an old email thread she'd forgotten to delete. The clerk barely looked up as he signed in, assuming he was just another spouse picking something up. Inside the unit, the air smelled of dust and cardboard. Ethan's hands shook as he lifted the door. What he found wasn't romantic. No love letters, no mementos, just documents, folders, copies of contracts, insurance paperwork, financial projections, neatly labeled by year. His name appeared less and less as the folders progressed. A cold understanding settled over him. This wasn't about replacing him. It was about removing him cleanly, legally, without mess. The affair wasn't the center of the plan. It was leverage, distraction, something to keep her emotionally invested elsewhere, while she prepared an exit that left Ethan with nothing. The unfairness of it all made him dizzy. He sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit, head in his hands, feeling something crack open inside him. Not anger. Not yet. It was grief. The kind that comes when you realize the person you loved never existed the way you believed. When he returned home, the house felt unfamiliar. Like a set built to resemble a life that had already ended. That evening, his phone buzzed again. "You found the storage unit, didn't you?" Ethan froze. His fingers hovered over the screen. This wasn't coincidence. This was surveillance. Someone had been watching his moves. The message wasn't mocking. It was calm, observant. "I don't want to hurt you," the next text read. "But you need to understand who you're dealing with." Ethan's heart pounded as he typed back for the first time. "Who is this?" Several minutes passed. "Someone who almost made the same mistake you did." The implication hit hard. He wasn't the first. Maybe not even the second. Ethan leaned back against the kitchen counter, mind racing. Whoever this was, they weren't aligned with his wife, or at least, not anymore. That made them dangerous. Or valuable. "Why warn me?" he typed. The reply came slower this time. "Because if you confront her without proof, you lose. And if you wait too long, you might lose more than your marriage." Ethan stared at the words until they blurred. The story was expanding again, stretching beyond what he could control. He felt like a character who had stumbled into the wrong film, one where the rules were harsher, the consequences permanent. He didn't respond again. Instead, he focused on what he could do. He made copies of everything from the storage unit, stored them off-site. He consulted a lawyer under the guise of a friend's situation, learning just how vulnerable he was and how carefully he would need to move. When his wife returned from her trip, she brought gifts, a new watch for him, a forced smile, stories that sounded rehearsed. "You didn't have to," Ethan said, fastening the watch around his wrist, feeling the irony settle heavy against his pulse. "I wanted to," she replied, watching his reaction closely. For a moment, their eyes locked. Something flickered there. Suspicion, perhaps, or fear. Ethan couldn't tell. That night, as they lay side by side in the dark, she reached for his hand. He let her. Her grip was warm, familiar, almost convincing, but Ethan knew now that every touch was part of a narrative she controlled, and control was the one thing he was quietly taking back. He no longer wanted answers, shouted across a room. He wanted the truth revealed at the exact moment it would matter most. Because if his wife believed she was orchestrating the ending, she was wrong. Ethan was still in the story, and he was done being the man in the back seat. Ethan began to live in layers. On the surface, he was the same husband he had always been: predictable, cooperative, quietly attentive. He asked about her day. He nodded at the right moments. He didn't question her late nights or sudden mood shifts. He let her believe the watch on his wrist was proof she still owned him. Beneath that surface, something colder moved with purpose. He stopped sleeping deeply. Every night became a planning session in the dark, his mind replaying conversations, mapping timelines, testing outcomes. He realized how easily he had once trusted shared routines, how dangerous familiarity could be when weaponized by someone who knew him intimately. One evening, she casually mentioned selling one of their joint investments. "It's just temporary," she said, swirling wine in her glass. A smart move. Ethan felt his pulse spike, but kept his expression neutral. "If you think it's best?" She studied him for a second longer than necessary. "You trust me?" "Right." The question wasn't emotional. It was tactical. "Of course," he said. That night, he checked the account. The transaction had already gone through. His signature, digitally replicated, sat beneath hers. Legal, clean, irreversible. That was when Ethan finally understood the full scale of the injustice. She wasn't acting impulsively. She was dismantling his life piece by piece, confident he wouldn't notice until it was too late. The next message from the anonymous contact arrived 2 days later. She's accelerating. No greeting, no explanation. Ethan typed back, "How do you know?" The reply came almost immediately. "Because she always does when she feels watched." A chill ran through him. "Who are you?" This time, the answer was longer. "I was engaged to her sister. Years ago. Has. What's C?" I lost everything after I asked the wrong questions. By the time I realized what was happening, the narrative was already written, and I was the villain in it. Ethan read the message 3 times. Pieces clicked into place. Family gatherings where certain topics were avoided. Stories that never quite lined up. The way his wife spoke about loyalty, about handling problems quietly. "Why help me now?" Ethan asked. There was a pause before the reply came. "Because someone should have warned me." From that point on, the messages became less frequent but more precise. Subtle confirmations, gentle corrections when Ethan assumed too much. The anonymous contact never told him what to do, only what not to underestimate. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at home grew tighter. His wife became more affectionate, more attentive. It was the kind of affection that arrived too late, like flowers sent after a funeral. She suggested trips, spoke about future renovations, about starting fresh. Ethan played along, feeling the weight of each lie settle between them like an invisible wall. One night, she suggested updating their wills. "Just to be responsible," she said, brushing her teeth, speaking through foam. "You never know." Ethan watched her reflection in the mirror, the calm certainty in her eyes, the assumption that he would agree. "That makes sense," he said. Inside, something snapped into place. That was the moment he stopped reacting and started preparing the reveal. He didn't rush. He waited. Let her move first. Let her believe she was ahead. He gathered every document, every message, every digital trace that told the real story. He made backups of backups, shared nothing with anyone who could be traced back to him, and slowly, quietly, he arranged the timing. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A formal dinner. Important people. Legal witnesses disguised as acquaintances. A setting she had chosen herself, believing it would showcase the life she was about to leave behind. She wore red that night, confident, radiant, untouchable. Ethan watched her greet guests with practiced warmth, her hand resting lightly on his arm like a prop. When she leaned close and whispered, "Everything's perfect," he almost smiled. Almost. As the evening unfolded, Ethan felt strangely calm. The fear that had once consumed him was gone, replaced by clarity. Whatever happened next, the truth would no longer belong only to her. At the exact moment, she stood to toast to celebrate new beginnings. Ethan stood as well. There was a flicker of surprise on her face. Then irritation. This wasn't in her script. He spoke evenly, not loudly. "He didn't need to, I think, before we talk about the future," he said. "There are a few things that deserve daylight." The room stilled. He didn't look at her. He looked at the people she had counted on to validate her story. Then he began methodically, calmly, without accusation. Just facts, timelines, documents projected behind him, her plans unfolding in cold, undeniable detail. Gasps rippled through the room. Whispers followed. Her face drained of color. For the first time, she looked at him not as something she owned, but as a variable she had miscalculated. Ethan met her gaze then, not with anger, not with triumph, with finality. The ending she had designed collapsed in real time, exposed by the one person she thought would never see it coming. And as the room erupted into chaos, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. The room didn't explode the way Ethan had imagined. It fractured. At first, there was silence, the kind that presses against your ears until you're painfully aware of your own breathing. Then the murmurs began, spreading like cracks in glass. Chairs shifted. Someone dropped a fork. A woman near the window covered her mouth. eyes fixed on the screen where documents still glowed in merciless clarity. Ethan's wife stood frozen, one hand gripping the edge of the table, as if the floor beneath her had tilted. Her confidence hadn't vanished all at once. It peeled away in layers, first disbelief, then calculation, then fear. She laughed softly, too softly. "This is ridiculous," she said, voice tight. "You're taking things out of context." Ethan didn't respond. He had learned that silence, when earned, was louder than argument. One of the guests, a man Ethan barely knew, but who had signed more contracts than Ethan ever would, cleared his throat. "These documents, are these verified?" Ethan nodded. Independently. Multiple times, the man's expression darkened. Another voice cut in. "Why would you do this?" someone asked her. "Why not just leave?" That question seemed to strike deeper than the evidence. Ethan watched her jaw tighten, watched her glance around the room, searching for an ally, for someone to rescue her narrative. No one moved. She turned to Ethan then, eyes sharp with something close to hatred. "You humiliated me," she hissed. "You planned this." Ethan finally spoke again. "No," he said quietly. "You did." End quote. The words landed with precision. Not dramatic, not cruel, just true. The rest of the evening unfolded in fragments. People left early, their expressions unreadable. Conversations splintered, phones came out, messages were sent. The world she had so carefully constructed began to erode under scrutiny. When they were alone at last, the silence felt different, emptier, colder. She sank into a chair, staring at nothing. "You think this makes you the good guy?" Ethan stood across from her, exhaustion finally catching up. "I think it makes me free," she scoffed. But there was no strength behind it now. "You have no idea what you've done." He considered that. "I know exactly what I've done. I stopped pretending." Her shoulders slumped. The performance was over. In the days that followed, consequences arrived quickly. Accounts were frozen, pending investigation. Contracts were suspended. People who once returned her calls immediately now took days or didn't respond at all. The narrative she had been so sure of slipped from her control, rewritten by facts she could no longer bury. Ethan moved out quietly. No dramatic exit, no shouting, just boxes packed with deliberate care. Each item he took felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. The anonymous messages stopped. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or abandoned. Perhaps both. Weeks passed. Then months. The legal aftermath was messy but fair, painful but survivable. Ethan learned how much of his identity had been wrapped around being chosen, being needed, being trusted. Without that framework, he felt hollow at first. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, something else grew in its place: clarity. He started running again, early mornings before the city woke. He cooked meals for one, read books he had abandoned years ago, reconnected with friends he had slowly drifted from without realizing how lonely he had become. One evening, as he sat on his small apartment balcony, watching the sun dip below the skyline, his phone buzzed. A single message. "You did what I couldn't. I hope it brings you peace." Ethan stared at the screen for a long time. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Some connections existed only to guide you through a storm, not to stay. He deleted the message, then set his phone down. For the first time since the night in the parking garage, his chest felt light. Ethan understood now that betrayal wasn't just about what someone else did to you. It was about what you allowed yourself to ignore, the small instincts you silence, the questions you swallow to keep the peace. He had lost a marriage, lost the future he thought he was building, but he had gained something far more enduring: his awareness, and with it, the quiet confidence that no one would ever trap him in the back seat of his own life again. Life didn't suddenly become peaceful after the exposure. It became quieter, which was different, and, in many ways, harder. In the silence, memories grew louder. Ethan discovered that healing wasn't a straight line, but a series of confrontations, with moments he thought he had already processed. A song on the radio could undo an entire afternoon. A familiar restaurant could turn his stomach. Sometimes, he'd reach for his phone out of habit, only to remember there was no one left on the other end who knew him the way he once believed she had. The unfairness still surfaced in unexpected waves. She had been the architect of the deception. Yet, she wasn't the one waking up disoriented in a quiet apartment, trying to remember who she had been before the marriage reshaped her routines, her voice, her sense of safety. Ethan had to relearn himself from fragments. Therapy helped, though not in the dramatic way movies promised. There were no sudden revelations, just slow, uncomfortable honesty. He learned how often he had minimized his own discomfort to avoid conflict, how he had mistaken endurance for loyalty, how being understanding had slowly turned into being invisible. One afternoon, weeks after the separation was finalized, Ethan ran into her by accident. It was at a coffee shop. Neither of them used to frequent a neutral place. Stripped of shared history, she looked different, not broken, but smaller, somehow. The confidence that once filled every space around her now sat carefully contained, like something she no longer trusted. They locked eyes for a brief moment, both startled. "Ethan," she said, standing. He nodded. "I didn't expect to see you." Neither of them did. They stood there awkwardly, two people connected by a life that no longer existed. For a moment, Ethan wondered if this would be the scene he'd imagined late at night. The confrontation, the apologies, the closure. Instead, she spoke first. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it," she admitted quietly. Exposing everything, Ethan studied her face. There was no remorse there, just surprise. "I didn't either," he said, "until I realized I didn't have a choice." She frowned. "You always had a choice. So did you." The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. They sat down, not together, but near enough to talk. She told him about the fallout, the contracts she'd lost, the friends who had distanced themselves, the family conversations that no longer ended in reassurance. "I didn't think it would cost this much," she said, stirring her coffee though she hadn't added sugar. Ethan felt a flicker of something pity. Maybe, but it passed. Cost was only shocking when you believed you wouldn't have to pay it. "I didn't either," he replied. She looked at him then, really looked, as if searching for something familiar. "Do you hate me?" Ethan considered the question carefully. Hate required energy. It required connection. "No," he said finally. "But I don't miss you either." That seemed to hurt more than anger would have. When they parted, there were no promises to stay in touch, no dramatic final words, just a quiet understanding that their paths had already diverged too far to intersect again. Ethan walked home, feeling unexpectedly lighter. In the months that followed, he built a life defined not by what he had lost, but by what he now refused to tolerate. He said no more often, asked questions sooner, trusted his instincts even when they made others uncomfortable. There were moments of loneliness, yes, but they were honest moments, not crowded with pretense. One evening, while sorting through old files on his laptop, Ethan found a draft email he had never sent years ago. It was addressed to his wife, written on a night he had felt especially distant from her, apologizing for things he hadn't done, promising to be better. He read it once, then he deleted it, not out of bitterness, but recognition. That version of him no longer existed and didn't need to. Ethan began volunteering with a local support group, quietly at first, listening to stories that sounded uncomfortably familiar. People who had ignored red flags, who had been told they were imagining things, who had learned too late that love without respect always comes with conditions. He didn't give advice, he just listened, and sometimes that was enough. On the anniversary of the night he hid in the car, Ethan went for a long drive alone. No destination, just motion. As the city lights blurred past, he realized something that surprised him. He wasn't angry at himself anymore. He had done the best he could with the truth he had at the time, and when the truth changed, so did he. That, he decided, was not weakness, it was growth. Ethan pulled over at a lookout just before midnight and stepped out into the cool air. The city stretched below him, full of stories intersecting and unraveling all at once. Somewhere out there, people were hiding, planning, loving, betraying, healing, just as he had. He breathed deeply. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something waiting to be taken from him. It felt open, and that was enough. Ethan didn't rush into rebuilding his life. He let it form slowly, the way muscles strengthen after an injury. Not by force, but by consistent, careful movement. Each small decision became an act of trust in himself, choosing where to live, how to spend his weekends, who deserved access to his time. For the first time in years, his choices weren't shaped by fear of conflict or the need to keep someone else comfortable. Still, there were moments when the past reached for him. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived at his apartment. He recognized the firm's logo instantly. His hands tightened around the envelope before he even opened it. Inside was a notice, formal, polite, unavoidable. She was contesting part of the settlement, claiming misrepresentation, hinting that he had acted maliciously. The old Ethan would have panicked, apologized, questioned himself. This version of him exhaled slowly and made a phone call. His lawyer listened, then said calmly, "This is a pressure tactic. She's trying to see if you'll fold." Ethan stared out the window at the street below, people moving freely, unaware of the quiet wars unfolding behind closed doors. "I won't," he said, and he didn't. The challenge dissolved weeks later, quietly withdrawn. No apology followed. None was needed. The silence was confirmation enough. Around that time, Ethan began to notice something else, something unexpected. He was no longer invisible to himself. He recognized his own reactions now, the tightening in his chest when something felt wrong, the calm when something felt right. He didn't override those signals anymore. That awareness changed how people responded to him. At work, he spoke with more certainty. Not louder, just clearer. When someone crossed a boundary, he named it. When a project didn't align with his values, he declined without elaborate explanations. To his surprise, the world didn't collapse. In many cases, it adjusted. One evening, a colleague invited him to a small gathering. Nothing formal, just conversation, laughter, no expectations. Ethan almost said no out of habit. Then he caught himself and said yes. That night, sitting on a balcony, surrounded by people who knew nothing about his past, he felt a strange sense of peace. No one expected him to perform. No one needed him to be smaller. He was simply present. Someone asked him, casually, "What changed for you this year?" Ethan thought about it, about the car, the darkness, the voice that didn't belong. The moment his life split in two, "I started listening to myself," he said. It was the simplest, truest answer he had. Later, as he walked home alone, under streetlights that no longer felt threatening, he realized something profound. Betrayal had taught him clarity, but healing had taught him discernment. He didn't need to armor himself against the world. He just needed to stop ignoring what his instincts were trying to protect. Weeks turned into months, months into a year. The story that once defined him became something he carried lightly, not hidden, but no longer heavy. When people asked, he told the truth without dramatizing it. When they didn't, he let it rest. One night, sorting through old boxes he had avoided unpacking, Ethan found a small notebook. Inside were handwritten plans from early in his marriage goals they had once shared, trips they never took, dreams written in careful ink. He flipped through the pages slowly. Instead of grief, he felt gratitude, not for the outcome, but for the clarity. Those dreams hadn't failed. They had simply belonged to a version of his life that had ended. And endings, he realized, were not punishments. They were permissions. Ethan closed the notebook and set it aside. He didn't throw it away. He didn't need to erase his past to honor his present. On a quiet Sunday morning, He took a long drive without music, letting his thoughts move freely. As the road stretched ahead, he smiled at the memory of who he had been, the man hiding in a car, afraid to breathe, afraid to know. That man had survived something unimaginable. This man had learned from it, and as the sun rose higher, casting light across the windshield, Ethan felt something steady settle inside him. Not triumph, not vengeance, self-respect, the kind that doesn't demand applause, the kind that doesn't need validation, the kind that ensures you never again accept a life where your voice disappears. He drove on, unafraid of what waited ahead, because whatever came next, he would meet it fully awake. Ethan thought the hardest part was over. He was wrong. Healing has a way of revealing one final truth. Just when you believe you've reached solid ground, it doesn't arrive with chaos or confrontation. It comes quietly, asking you to decide who you are when no one is forcing your hand anymore. The call came on a gray Tuesday afternoon. An unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it. "Ethan Cole," a woman asked when he answered. "Yes. My name is Marissa Lang. I'm an investigator. I'm calling regarding a statement your ex-wife made last year." Something new has surfaced. His stomach tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. Some stories don't end cleanly. They wait, Marissa explained carefully. After the public exposure and legal unraveling, another party had come forward, someone who had been harmed in a similar way: financial manipulation, emotional leverage, a pattern emerging only now that the silence had been broken. "You were the first person who stopped it early," Marissa said. "That matters." After the call ended, Ethan sat motionless at his desk. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. He was resolved. He provided what he had: documents, timelines, records he had preserved instinctively, without knowing why. He didn't embellish, didn't editorialize, just facts. When the investigation expanded, he felt something unexpected: relief. Not because justice was guaranteed, but because the truth was no longer resting on his shoulders alone. Weeks later, Marissa called again. "You saved more people than you realize," she said, by refusing to stay quiet. That night, Ethan walked through the city longer than usual. The streets buzzed with life, laughter spilling from restaurants, couples arguing softly on sidewalks, strangers passing each other without knowing how close their lives came to intersecting. He realized then that betrayal doesn't just damage one relationship. It ripples outward, reinforced by silence, enabled by politeness, protected by the fear of being seen as dramatic or unstable. And silence, he understood now, was the real accomplice. Ethan didn't speak publicly about what happened. He didn't need to, but he stopped minimizing it, stopped framing it as just something that happened. It had been something that changed him. One evening, he found himself back at the underground parking garage, the same one where it all began. Not by accident, by choice. He parked, stepped out, and stood in the space where he had once waited in the dark, heart racing, afraid to move. The garage smelled the same: oil, concrete, echoes. But he wasn't the same man. He closed his eyes and let the memory surface fully this time, not to relive the pain, but to acknowledge it, the fear, the shock. The moment he understood his life was not what he thought. When he opened his eyes, the space felt smaller, less powerful. Ethan smiled faintly and walked away. Later that night, he wrote something for himself. Not a letter to her, not an apology, a boundary. "I will never again confuse loyalty with silence. I will never again shrink to make someone else comfortable. I will never again ignore my instincts to preserve an illusion." He didn't frame it, didn't share it. He folded the paper and placed it in a drawer. That promise was enough. Months later, sitting across from someone new at a quiet cafe, Ethan felt the difference immediately. Not sparks or fantasy, just ease. When he spoke, he wasn't measuring his words. When he listened, he wasn't bracing for manipulation. At one point, she asked him gently. What ended your last relationship? Ethan didn't hesitate. I realized I was being erased, and I chose not to be. She nodded. No judgment, no probing. That was when he knew he was ready, not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer controlled him. As he walked home that night, Ethan thought about the version of himself who hid in the back seat, believing love meant endurance, believing betrayal was something that happened to other people. He wished he could tell that man something, not to warn him, not to comfort him, but to promise him this: you survive, you wake up, and one day, you thank yourself for listening when it finally mattered. Because the moment you stop hiding from the truth, from yourself, from the fear of losing what was never safe to begin with, that's the moment your life truly starts moving forward. And this time, you're in the driver's seat. Ethan didn't realize how much strength he had gained until the world tested it one last time. The email arrived without warning, buried between routine messages and advertisements. At first glance, it looked ordinary legal language, neutral tone. But the sender's name made his fingers pause over the trackpad. It was from her, not directly, but through counsel. A request for a private meeting, no accusations, no demands, just a carefully worded appeal to resolve remaining emotional matters. A year ago, that phrasing would have pulled him back into confusion, hope, even the illusion that closure came from conversation. Now, he recognized it for what it was, an attempt to reclaim narrative control. Ethan closed the email and let it sit unanswered for 3 days. When he finally replied, it was brief, polite, firm. He declined. The response came quickly this time, stripped of its earlier restraint. She accused him of cruelty, of moving on too easily, of turning people against her. The words were sharp, familiar, and strangely ineffective. Ethan read them once, then deleted the message. The realization was almost startling. Her voice no longer held power over him, not because he had hardened, but because he had clarified who he was without her interpretation. That night, he slept deeply, dreamless, restful. In the weeks that followed, Ethan focused on building rituals that grounded him. Morning runs, cooking dinner instead of ordering out, calling his parents more often, not out of obligation, but connection. He discovered that stability wasn't something you found after chaos. It was something you practiced. One evening, as he was leaving the support group he volunteered with, a man approached him quietly. "I heard your story," the man said, "or pieces of it." Ethan nodded. "Then you know the important parts." The man hesitated. "I'm where you were, before everything came out. I don't know if I'm imagining things." Ethan studied him for a long moment. He saw the same exhaustion, the same self-doubt, the same fear of being wrong. "You're not here because you're imagining things," Ethan said gently. "You're here because something doesn't feel right." The man swallowed. "What if I destroy my life by asking questions?" Ethan remembered the parking garage, the darkness, the moment of knowing. "What destroys you," he said slowly, "is pretending you don't already know." The man nodded, tears forming, and thanked him before walking away. Ethan watched him go, aware that some truths can't be given, only recognized. That was the strange gift of everything he'd been through. He couldn't save anyone, but he could remind them they weren't crazy for listening to themselves. One quiet afternoon, Ethan found himself driving through a neighborhood he hadn't visited in years. Streets lined with familiar houses, the old version of his life tucked neatly behind closed doors. He didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He simply passed through, feeling no pull to return. At a red light, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. There were lines there now, earned ones. Not from stress alone, but from awareness. He looked steadier, more present. When the light turned green, he smiled and kept driving. Later that evening, he sat on his balcony again, the city alive below him. He thought about how easily his story could have ended differently, how close he had come to staying silent, to shrinking, to letting someone else define the ending because he was afraid of the fallout. The injustice of what had been done to him hadn't disappeared. It didn't need to. Justice, he had learned, wasn't about erasing harm. It was about refusing to carry it forward. Ethan opened his laptop and began writing not for an audience, not for validation, but for clarity. He wrote about trust, about manipulation disguised as love, about how people are taught to doubt their instincts in the name of harmony. When he finished, he closed the document without saving it. Some truths are meant to be lived, not published. As the night deepened, Ethan felt a quiet certainty settle in him. His life was no longer organized around avoiding pain or preserving illusions. It was organized around honesty, first with himself, then with the world. He thought again of the man in the back seat, barely breathing. Afraid that knowing the truth would destroy him, he wished he could reach back through time and say this: "It hurts, more than you think, but it also frees you, more than you can imagine. Because when you stop hiding, when you choose awareness over comfort, integrity over illusion, you don't just survive betrayal, you outgrow it. And from that place, nothing can take your life away from you again." Ethan stopped measuring his life by what had happened to him. That shift didn't come with a single realization or a dramatic moment. It arrived quietly, through repetition, through days that were ordinary and honest, through nights where he slept without bracing for betrayal, through conversations that didn't require him to shrink or perform. One evening, while clearing out the last remaining box from his old storage unit, he found an envelope tucked between tax files and outdated manuals. His handwriting was on it. The date stopped him cold. It was written a week after the night in the parking garage. Inside was a letter he had forgotten he'd written, never sent, never finished. A fractured attempt to explain what he was feeling to someone who had already decided not to listen. The words were desperate in places, apologetic where they didn't need to be, full of questions that had since found their answers. Ethan read it slowly. Instead of shame, he felt compassion. That man hadn't been weak. He had been loyal in a world that punished loyalty without discernment. He had trusted because trust was part of his values, not because he was naive. Ethan folded the letter carefully and threw it away. Not to erase it, but to honor the fact that it no longer represented him. In the months that followed, life continued to test his boundaries in smaller, subtler ways. A colleague tried to take credit for his work. An acquaintance pushed too hard for personal details. A new relationship moved faster than felt right. Each time, Ethan responded differently than he once would have. He spoke up. He slowed things down. He walked away when clarity didn't come. And each time, the world adjusted. That was the part no one ever told him, that healthy boundaries don't destroy relationships. They refine them. What falls apart was never meant to hold. One late night, after a long walk through the city, Ethan stopped at a quiet overlook. The skyline shimmered below him, millions of lives unfolding in parallel, some honest, some hidden, some on the brink of change without knowing it yet. He thought about how easily this story could have ended, with him broken, bitter, or closed off. How tempting it had been to let anger define the rest of his life. But anger, he realized, he had an expiration date. What replaced it was discernment. He no longer romanticized suffering. He no longer believed love required endurance without reciprocity. And most importantly, he no longer mistook familiarity for safety. One morning, months later, Ethan woke up with a strange realization. He hadn't thought about her in days, not with resentment, not with curiosity, not even with sadness. She had become part of his history, not his identity. That was when he understood that healing isn't about forgetting, it's about integration. The pain doesn't vanish, it loses its authority. Ethan went about his day with a lightness that surprised him. He worked, he laughed, he made plans for the future without scanning them for risk, without assuming loss. That evening, he received a message from someone in the support group, a simple note. I asked the questions. It was hard, but I'm glad I didn't ignore myself anymore. Thank you. Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he looked out the window, watching the city breathe. He thought about how truth moves not like an explosion, but like a slow current, reshaping everything it touches over time. He finally typed back, "You did the hard part yourself," because that was the truth. No one had saved him. He had listened, he had chosen clarity, he had stepped out of the dark. That night, Ethan stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. He saw someone older than the man who hid in the car, but steadier. Someone whose eyes didn't search for permission anymore. He turned off the light and went to bed, not haunted by the past, not anxious about the future, just present. And somewhere, deep in that stillness, the final piece of the story settled into place, not as a dramatic ending, but as a quiet certainty. Betrayal didn't define his life. Awareness did. And from that point on, nothing built on silence or deception would ever have a place in it again. Ethan didn't announce his freedom to anyone. He lived it. That, he learned, was far more powerful. There were no dramatic declarations, no social posts reclaiming his narrative, no speeches about resilience. Instead, there were choices, quiet, consistent ones that reshaped his days. He chose peace over familiarity, truth over comfort, presence over performance. And slowly, the world responded. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after the night in the parking garage, Ethan received an invitation he hadn't expected. A conference, small, private, focused on ethical leadership and financial transparency. His name had been recommended anonymously. He almost declined. Public spaces that revolved around stories still made him uneasy. But something told him this wasn't about exposure. It was about alignment. When he arrived, there was no spotlight waiting for him. Just conversations, thoughtful ones, people speaking honestly about failures, blind spots, and the cost of ignoring intuition in high-stakes environments. For the first time, Ethan realized how universal his experience was, not the specifics, but the pattern. Trust exploited, silence rewarded until it wasn't. The quiet erosion of self that happens when people are taught to doubt their instincts in the name of harmony. During one session, a speaker asked a simple question. What was the moment you knew something was wrong, but chose to look away? The room grew still. Ethan felt his chest tighten. The back seat, the darkness, the voice. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't share details. He didn't need to. "I knew," he said calmly, "when my body reacted before my mind could explain it. And I almost talked myself out of listening." The room nodded, not out of pity, but recognition. Later that evening, as people gathered in small groups, someone approached him. A woman in her 40s, grounded, direct. "I don't know your whole story," she said, "but I know that look. You didn't just survive something. You learned from it." Ethan smiled. "I didn't want to waste it." She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. They talked for a long time, not about the past, but about values. About how clarity changes the way you build relationships. How trust becomes something you offer intentionally, not automatically. When the conference ended, Ethan drove home feeling something unfamiliar, not relief. Purpose, not in a grand sense, but in the quiet awareness that his experience wasn't something to hide or relive endlessly. It was something to integrate and, when appropriate, allow to inform how he moved through the world. Weeks later, on a calm Sunday morning, Ethan returned to the parking garage one last time. Not out of nostalgia, out of completion. He parked his car, turned off the engine, and sat in silence. The hum of distant traffic echoed softly. The space felt ordinary now. Neutral, no longer charged with fear or revelation. He stepped out, walked to the spot where he had once waited, folded in on himself, afraid to breathe, and then he stood there, fully upright. He didn't feel anger, or sadness, or even triumph. He felt gratitude, not for the betrayal, but for the moment it forced him awake. Ethan closed his eyes briefly and then walked back to his car and drove away without looking back. That night, sitting in his apartment with the windows open, city air drifting in, Ethan reflected on how much had changed not externally, but internally. He no longer needed certainty from others to trust himself. He no longer needed validation to set boundaries. He no longer feared loss the way he once had because he understood now that losing what isn't safe is not a tragedy, it's a correction. As he turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, one final thought crossed his mind. A quiet, grounding truth he carried forward. The moment you stop hiding in the dark, whether it's a car, a relationship, or your own silence, is the moment your life stops being something that happens to you and becomes something you consciously choose. Ethan slept peacefully, not because nothing bad could ever happen again, but because whatever did, he would meet it awake. Ethan woke before dawn the next morning, not because of anxiety, but because his body had learned a new rhythm. The city outside his window was still quiet, wrapped in that brief, a fragile pause before the day demanded anything. He lay there for a while, listening to his own breathing, aware of how different it felt to wake up without dread pressing against his chest. He made coffee and stood by the window as the sky slowly shifted from black to blue. There was a time when mornings like this had been filled with questions. What mood would she be in? What version of the truth would he be navigating today? What piece of himself would he have to give up to keep things calm? Now, the silence belonged to him. That difference mattered more than he ever expected. Later that day, Ethan met with his lawyer one final time. The paperwork was routine, signatures, confirmations, the official closing of a chapter that had once consumed his entire life. As he signed the last document, he felt no surge of victory or sorrow, only a steady sense of completion. "You handled this well," the lawyer said, offering a polite smile. "Most people don't." Ethan nodded. "I didn't at first." He walked out of the building and into the afternoon sun, realizing that for the first time since the betrayal, there was nothing left to resolve. No loose ends waiting to pull him backward, no unfinished conversations haunting his thoughts. Just forward motion. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began to notice how people responded differently to him, not because they knew his story, but because he no longer negotiated his presence. He spoke with quiet certainty. He listened without disappearing. He didn't over-explain or apologize for existing. That shift drew the right people closer and filtered out the rest. One evening, he received a message from someone he hadn't heard from in years. An old friend who had drifted away during his marriage. They met for dinner, catching up cautiously at first, then more openly. "You seem solid," the friend said at one point. "Different, but in a good way." Ethan smiled. "I stopped pretending I was okay when I wasn't." The friend nodded. "That'll do it." As the night went on, Ethan realized how much he had missed simple, honest connection. Not intensity, not drama, just being seen without performance. It reminded him that healing wasn't about isolation, it was about discernment. There were still moments when the past surfaced unexpectedly. A song, a smell, a phrase that echoed something she used to say. But those moments no longer dragged him under. They passed through him like weather, acknowledged and then released. One afternoon, while cleaning his apartment, Ethan found the watch she had given him, the one he'd worn the night everything unraveled. He held it in his palm for a long moment, feeling the weight of what it once represented. Then he placed it in a donation box, not as a rejection of the past, but as a quiet acknowledgement that he no longer needed reminders of who he had been to move forward. That evening, Ethan took a long walk through the city. Couples passed him, some laughing, some tense, some lost in their own private negotiations. He didn't judge them. He recognized them. Everyone was carrying something unseen. As he crossed a bridge, he stopped at the center and looked down at the water moving steadily below. It reminded him of how truth works, not loud, not rushed, but relentless. It finds its way through every crack, reshaping even the strongest structures over time. Ethan understood now. that the most dangerous lies weren't the ones others told you. They were the ones you told yourself to survive. He had told himself that patience would fix everything, that loyalty meant endurance, that love required self-erasure. Those beliefs had kept him trapped far longer than any person ever could. Letting them go had been the real escape. As the sun dipped lower, casting gold across the water, Ethan felt something settle deep inside him. Not closure, not forgiveness, acceptance. He accepted that he had been betrayed. He accepted that he had ignored his instincts longer than he should have. He accepted that none of that made him weak. It made him human. And humans, he had learned, were capable of extraordinary clarity once they stopped running from the truth. Ethan turned and continued his walk, blending back into the rhythm of the city. His story no longer needed to be dramatic to be meaningful. It had already done its work, reshaping how he moved, how he trusted, how he chose. The night he hid in the back seat had taken something from him, but everything that followed had given him something far greater. His life, fully his this time, was finally in motion. Ethan began to notice that the hardest moments no longer came from memories of betrayal, but from moments of unexpected peace. It startled him how unfamiliar calm could feel. There were afternoons when nothing went wrong, no tension, no hidden meanings, no emotional labor required, and his body would still brace, waiting for impact. He'd catch himself scanning conversations for danger, searching faces for subtle shifts, listening for the old signals that once meant survival. When that happened, he didn't shame himself. He paused, breathed, reminded himself that hypervigilance was a scar, not a flaw. Healing, he learned, wasn't about proving strength. It was about allowing softness without fear. One evening, as rain streaked down his windows, Ethan cooked dinner slowly, deliberately. No distractions, no phone nearby. He moved through the kitchen with ease, realizing that he used to rush everything: meals, conversations, decisions, afraid that slowing down would invite conflict. Now, slowness felt safe. As he ate, he thought about how his old life had been built around anticipation, anticipating her moods, her reactions, her approval. He had confused attentiveness with love, vigilance with devotion. It had taken losing everything to see the difference. After dinner, he sat with a notebook, not to analyze the past, but to imagine the future. Not in grand plans or rigid goals, but values. He wrote words like honesty, steadiness, reciprocity, courage. He didn't write love, not yet, because love, he understood now, was not something you chased or endured. It was something that emerged naturally when you stopped betraying yourself. Days later, Ethan received a message from someone he had met at the conference months earlier. A simple invitation for coffee, no pressure, no expectations. He agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, sunlight filtering through wide windows. The conversation flowed easily, not because it was perfect, but because it was unforced. They spoke about work, about books, about how people change after life disrupts them. At one point, she said, "You seem comfortable being alone." Ethan considered that. "I learned to be," he replied. "Not as a defense, as a foundation." She smiled. "That's rare." He didn't mistake her interest for destiny. He didn't project meaning where there was none. He simply enjoyed the moment for what it was, connection without urgency. When they parted, there was no promise of more, and yet no sense of loss. That too, as weeks passed, Ethan felt increasingly anchored in himself. His days were full, but not crowded, purposeful, but not rigid. He had space to think, to feel, to respond instead of react. And occasionally, when he least expected it, gratitude surfaced. Gratitude for the version of himself who hadn't looked away that night in the car, who had stayed silent long enough to listen, who had chosen truth over comfort, even when the cost was terrifying. He understood now that the moment of shock, the betrayal, the injustice, the unraveling, had not been the end of his life. It had been the interruption he needed. One night, while walking home under a sky heavy with clouds, Ethan passed a parked car with its engine off. Lights dim, interior barely visible. For a split second, the image froze him in place. Then he smiled, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer owned him. He kept walking. At home, he turned off the lights and stood by the window, watching the city pulse softly below, thousands of lives unfolding at once, some filled with honesty, others quietly breaking. Many hovering at the edge of realization, not knowing yet that their lives were about to change. Ethan hoped quietly, without urgency, that when those moments came, they would listen, because the truth, once seen, does not destroy you. It reorganizes you. It strips away what was never stable and leaves you standing in something real, something earned. As he prepared for bed, Ethan reflected on the arc of his story not as a victim's journey, not as a triumph, but as an awakening, a shift from living defensively to living deliberately. He no longer needed an ending that felt dramatic or vindicating. The real resolution was this: he trusted himself, and that trust shaped every choice that followed. Ethan lay down, the city humming beyond the walls, and closed his eyes, not retreating from the world, but resting within it, ready for whatever came next. Time kept moving, and for once, Ethan moved with it, instead of chasing or resisting it. There were days when nothing significant happened, no revelations, no emotional milestones, no symbolic moments worth remembering. And those days, he realized, were quietly extraordinary. They were proof that his life was no longer defined by crisis. Normalcy, once boring to him, had become sacred. One Saturday morning, Ethan visited his parents. He hadn't been avoiding them before, but he hadn't been fully present either. During the worst years of his marriage, every visit had been filtered through exhaustion and distraction. Now, he sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee that was too strong, listening to his father complain about the garden fence and his mother talk about a neighbor's new dog. At one point, his mother studied him carefully. "You look lighter," she said. Ethan smiled. "I feel lighter." She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Parents, he realized, often sense truths long before their children are ready to admit them. Later, as he drove home, he thought about how much of his life had once been spent managing appearances, making sure things looked fine even when they weren't. That habit had been hard to unlearn. Sometimes, he still caught himself instinctively minimizing discomfort, brushing past awkwardness, choosing silence over honesty. But now, when he noticed it, he corrected course. That was the difference. One afternoon at work, a senior colleague proposed a plan that felt wrong, ethically questionable, legally gray. In the past, Ethan would have hesitated, worried about consequences, about being labeled difficult. He would have swallowed the discomfort and told himself it wasn't his responsibility. This time, he spoke up. "I'm not comfortable with this," he said calmly, "and I won't be part of it." The room went quiet. A few people exchanged glances. Someone sighed. Then, unexpectedly, another voice joined his. "I was thinking the same thing," a colleague said. "I just didn't know how to say it." The plan was revised. The tension eased. Afterward, as Ethan walked back to his desk, he felt a subtle surge of pride, not in being right, but in being aligned. He understood now how silence spreads, and how courage, even quiet courage, does too. That evening, as he left the office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the woman he'd met for coffee weeks earlier. "I enjoyed our conversation. Would you like to walk sometime?" No pressure. Ethan read it twice, noticing how his body responded. No tightness, no rush, just openness. He replied yes. They met a few days later at a riverside path just before sunset. They walked side by side, sometimes talking, sometimes comfortable in silence. When she laughed, it was unguarded. When she listened, it was attentive without expectation. At one point, she asked, "Do you believe people can really change?" Ethan looked at the water, thinking, "I think people can wake up," he said. Change is what happens after that, if they're willing to do the work. She nodded, as if that answer mattered. They didn't label anything. They didn't make promises. And when they parted, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. Not desperation, not attachment. Just curiosity about what might grow if given space. That night, alone in his apartment, Ethan reflected on how different this felt from his past. He wasn't trying to prove his worth. He wasn't auditioning for love. He wasn't ignoring warning signs in the hope that effort would compensate for incompatibility. He was simply present. As he prepared for bed, he caught sight of himself in the mirror again. The man staring back looked calm, not because life was perfect, but because he trusted his ability to handle imperfection. That trust had been hard-earned. Ethan thought again of the night. Everything changed. The darkness of the car, the betrayal unfolding in real time, the shock that had cracked his life open. For so long, he had seen that moment as a wound. Now, he saw it as a threshold. Crossing it had cost him a marriage, a future he thought was secure, and a version of himself built on self-denial. But it had given him something far more durable: discernment, integrity, and the courage to listen when something felt wrong. He lay down, and lights off, the city breathing softly outside. Tomorrow would be another ordinary day, and that, finally, felt like enough. Sometimes, the most painful moments in life aren't meant to destroy us. They're meant to wake us up. This story isn't really about betrayal. It's about the quiet instincts we ignore, the questions we silence, and the price we pay when we choose comfort over truth. Real strength isn't staying and enduring what slowly erases you. Real strength is listening when something feels wrong, even when walking away costs you everything you thought you wanted. Healing doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means learning from it, learning to trust yourself again, to set boundaries without guilt, and to believe that peace is not something you earn through suffering. It's something you choose through honesty. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. What part hit closest to home for you? And if you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep sharing powerful, real-life stories that remind us we're not alone, and that it's never too late to choose yourself.